Tania Waters, welcome to the Resolution Room all the way from WA today.
Having me, Damien.
Pleasure. Now, I'm going to have a crack at doing an intro and you're going to fill in the gaps,
Sure,
okay?
sure.
So you've got a management degree, but you've been very senior in global roles in HR and legal services. You're a conflict management specialist, you're an accredited mediator, and you do conflict coaching as well. And your business called Tate was started in 2021. So you've hit the 5-year mark. Is that? Yeah,
That's correct.
indeed.
Correct.
That's correct. You've had extensive experience in workplace mediations, and I want to talk about that. It's an area of work that I'm passionate about, but I've had a few mediations, but my mediation practice is more in litigation, in particular personal injury, consistent with my background. But it's definitely an area of passion, and I thought I'd get you on because we can talk about all things conflict, and we can talk about my view that mediation is underutilized in workplace dynamics. Do you think in the HR toolkit, mediation ought to be used more quickly and more regularly?
Yes, please. Both. Yes, the sooner the better. It definitely helps coming in at the beginning of a conflict as opposed to sort of after an investigation, which is what happens in the majority of the matters that I get called for. I seem to have clients that once they have had some experience with using mediation, then they ring again and again and again. The phone just rings and says, "Oh, Tania, we've got another one." You know, getting those first-time clients over the line to actually understand what mediation is and when it may be suitable and when it might not be suitable and to give it a go, that's the hardest thing. Once they've done it, then they seem to want to mediate almost everything.
Exactly. Now, there are certain matters that you need to investigate. I'm not an employment lawyer, but I've had experience in that space and also in leadership. But investigations can exacerbate perspectives and conflict, can't it? You've got to be careful about going down that path prematurely without looking at more creative ways, potentially, of, say, using a mediation. Have you seen that play out?
Yeah, look, I think that unless the matter is sort of misconduct, where you're looking to exit somebody from an organisation, if it's sort of outside of misconduct and you're looking to retain both the parties, then mediation is by far your best chance than taking them down an investigative route. And so a matter I've got at the moment, they have had an investigation. They're never a quick process. And the findings have been unsubstantiated, which is not surprising. You and I could have told them that right at the outset because it's a he said, she said, and there's no witnesses. So the complainant's really upset because they've said, well, you know, how could they be unsubstantiated? I know what I've experienced. So that's not fair. And for the respondent, they're like, well, of course they're unsubstantiated because it never happened. And I've worked here for 20 years and you haven't taken my word for it. There's been no benefit of the doubt afforded to me. There's been no care afforded to me as the respondent. It's like I've been guilty before the investigation ever happened. And now they've got to work together. So if they were upset before, they're usually far more upset at the other end of an investigation. So yes, I think a very specific matters absolutely should be investigated, but they pretty much centre around, in a workplace context, misconduct. Anything outside of that, it's worthwhile mediating, but I would say that obviously as a mediator.
And have you seen in the course of those very interpersonal type issues you get and people in respective camps, and often there's other people in various camps as well that come in workplaces, have you had some success in your mediation practicing shifting perspectives and understandings?
Oh, I think every mediation you have a shift in perspective and understanding, because if two people are in a room together and they're actually talking about the thing that they need to talk about, it disrupts your own story about, you know, what's happened in your own mind. You know, we're all meaning-making machines. Something happens. Even you and I today, Damien, will walk away from this and we'll both have different perspectives of how the conversation unfolded and our own performance in it and, you know, and our interaction. So that's, you know, central to being a human being. So, yes, I think having people in the room actually talking about what's happened and why it's mattered as much as it's mattered. The great thing about mediation in that context is it's not about right or wrong. It's not about true or false or truth and lies. It's simply about hearing each other's perspectives on what your experience was, Damien, what my experience was, and then sense making together. How on earth did it come to this? And when we can go, well, I can figure out actually how we've got to this now, Damien. I may never have said or done anything that you said or done, but now that I've heard your perspectives on it, I can make sense about, why perhaps you did do those things or didn't do those things, and vice versa. And so now we're here. What do we want to do with it? So it's effectively, the first part is sense making of how on earth did it ever come to this? And then when we can sort of have a shared perspective on that, then we're best placed to figure out, well, how do we want things to be different so we never end up here again?
In my workplace mediations, I've seen the power of that. And I've also said to people, we're both here to solve a problem. So it's sort of a joint ownership of a problem in terms of why we've got here. I agree entirely. Do you think that because the word mediation has been co-opted often by the legal industry around, say, litigation, that it sometimes have a very formal connotation? So I've been approached by organizations and they've shied away from using that word actually and said, can we have a facilitated conversation?
Yep.
But really I'm acting entirely as a mediator.
It's no difference.
What's that about, do you think? Have you noticed that as well in the West?
Yeah, absolutely. Quite often they'll say to me, could you change the document that I sent out? Can you change mediation and call it a facilitated conversation or facilitated discussion? Which, of course, I'm happy to do, because in the context of the mediation we're talking about, that's what it is. It is a facilitated conversation that happens to have a facilitated negotiation at the end of it. But before they're ready to negotiate, they actually have to figure out, well, how did we get here and what do we want before they can do that bit. So no problem changing the name. And yes, I think, people don't realise there's lots of different types of mediation. So there's not just one style. So it might be an evaluative mediation, which is different from a facilitative mediation, which can be different from a transformative style of mediation or a narrative style of mediation, and others. So typically people know about mediation because they've been divorced, and perhaps they've sat in a different room from their spouse, and they've had a mediator running between the rooms passing messages to bang out a deal so we can all move on. And that's not what workplace mediation is about. So yeah, it's a hard sell.
Yeah, so a lot of my mediation is what I call shuttle-based settlement, similar to the family space, although slightly different because of the players involved. But this mediation is much more about joint conversations and about joint problem solving. And I want to pick your brain on this as well. I have noticed that sometimes it doesn't begin and end in the same sort of way other mediations do. In other words, there are times when I also have an ongoing coaching. At the end of a mediation, I might have some ongoing coaching or facilitation work to keep things on track. Have you noticed that as well in your business and practice?
Look, I've drawn some really strict boundaries around my mediation practice about what I do and what I don't do. And I used to have an exec coaching practice on the side, which I've closed that down from, effective 1 January this year to only focus on mediation. I mean, mediation's always been sort of 80% of my work anyway, but now it's 100% of my work. I have lots of people who work in that space. I know some excellent exec coaches, and I will then go and refer that work on. But for me, I just love to mediate. And from a calendar perspective, for me, doing that ongoing stuff takes out my days of where I can mediate. So it's primarily calendar-based, where I've decided I'm just going to do the thing that I love to do, and that is to mediate. Yeah.
Are your clients across all sectors, government, private enterprise?
Yeah, probably 80% state government, and the remaining 20% is, large private businesses. And I do some not-for-profit, corporate, I've got a number of law firm clients who are litigation practices, and you see them in the news standing on the steps of the court, but when they have a conflict, they mediate. What a shame I can't go and, tell the world, but, it's interesting.
It's interesting, all right. And let's talk about that before I want to talk about conflict more broadly. Lawyers, I find, having led them, and you've been working there for many years, are quite conflict adverse often. And a lot of things aren't said and build up. And there's kind of historically in law firms, there was a freeze out mentality. If someone wasn't working, you just sort of stopped communicating. And are we, inverted commas, lawyers, getting any better at that?
Well, look,
Conflict aversion?
I've been out for 5 years. So the last time I worked in a law firm was 5 years ago. It hadn't got any better when I left then. I think it probably has got better now because certainly in WA, in that time since I've left, there's been a big change to the Work Health and Safety Act. And those changes came out in sort of March 2022. And so you could no longer, as an employer in Western Australia anyway, you can no longer turn a blind eye to conflict that's happening in the workplace or to justify it and say, well, look, that's just the way Tania is. And so, we've got all these other workarounds. Now, employers have a positive obligation to actually address workplace conflict. They don't have to resolve it, but they have to show that they've taken steps to effectively address it. So probably, I'm guessing it has changed for the better, Damien, but I don't, I haven't been inside the firm. I've mediated in firms, but I haven't been on the ground in the firms.
Yeah, I tend to agree, Tania. I mean, I think the psychosocial code, the notion of workplace conflict having to be looked at and addressed earlier is probably coming more to the fore. I still think there's often a reluctance to use external mediators. There's often the attempt first to try to fix it in inverted commas, but it's often kind of, frankly, having led a law firm too, brushed over a bit at times. And the advantage of an external person is you have a real deep dive into it and really try to solve the problem together.
I was talking to a HR manager last week who was talking to me about a matter that she was dealing with. And she made a comment along the lines of, oh, well, Tania, we want to bring you in because, you've got far more skills in this area than we do. And I stopped her there and said, look, it might not be the fact. In fact, she may well be a better mediator than I am. Who's to say? However, the benefit, the superpower that I have is the fact that I'm independent and I'm external to the organisation. Because in reality, if you're in a workplace and you're having some difficulties with a colleague and it's going to be mediated internally, you really have to be very careful what you disclose in that mediation. If it's your boss who is conducting the mediation or someone in HR or someone further up, you really need to make sure that you look good and avoid looking bad because it might affect your next REM review, it might affect your next promotion opportunity. Whereas if they have someone external who is independent, my duties of care are very different. And I can sit there and hear all the nuts and bolts and they can bring out their ugly side if that's what it takes to actually dig down and sort out what it is. Because I have no ongoing impact to their employment. It's confidential, it's locked in our bubble, and no one else inside the organisation needs to know about it. So it's not necessarily expertise based, although you'd hope that if I do it for a living, I have got some skills. But aside from that, it's really the independence that matters, Damien.
Indeed. And I think it's very true. And perception matters too. As good as HR is, they're in the organisation. So that whole perception that you bring to the table from the lens of the people participating is also really important. I read a lot of your work. One of the things I think you've said is that we often refer, and I've said it as a shorthand at times for conflict. Oh, there's a personality clash here. I've heard myself say it. There's a personality clash. What's your view on that? Why do you think that that's often a misnomer, personality clash, and why do we use that expression? What may be really more fundamental than a personality clash?
I think the reason we say it is it's just a simple answer to a complex question. It's easy to look at people and say, well, they're in conflict with one another, and without getting into the whys. Usually, most people, organisations actually haven't sat down and listened without trying to solve it, but genuinely listened to what is actually going on. So you see people at loggerheads and the simple answer is that it's personality. But the reality is we all have different personalities and, we can get on with different personalities with family members and with neighbours and people at the coffee shop, etc. And we're able to manoeuvre through those different personalities most of the time in life. But in a workplace, there are many factors, and it's typically things around, autonomy, things around, allocation of resources, things around clarity of expectations. So there's always systemic and structural issues that feed into what we might see as two people fighting and it being a personality clash.
I've thought the same, that there's a lot of things that underlie it, but with sort of a shorthand that we often seize upon without drilling down into why we're in that situation. On the issue of workplace mediations in particular, have you seen firsthand creating sustainable change in relationships, or do you think there's a tendency for people to revert back? Once again, there's this notion that we've all got fixed personalities,
Yeah. No, it's just a great question. Thank you for asking it. No, the upside for change is enormous. And that's another thing that I love about mediation instead of exec coaching, is that, in mediation, when the two people are in the room together and they're having a really difficult conversation about what it is that they've both been so upset about, you can't be unchanged by that. The people that walk in the room never leave the room, regardless of where they get to, unaffected, permanently unaffected by what's happened, because the learning that happens is experiential and it happens moment by moment. So if you think of, an investigation where there's some findings and it says, Damien needs to work on his communication style. Damien would benefit from doing this training or this coaching, etc. And that's sort of the feedback that you get. And then you sit one-on-one with a coach and you have some self-reflection. That can be very effective and is very effective for a certain amount of change. But to actually sit in a room with the person who says, hey, Damien, when you do this, this is what it's like for me. This is how it plays out for me. This is how I feel about myself, how I feel about you. This is what impacts my motivation. This is actually how I want to respond to you in those moments. You can't hear that stuff and it not permanently, I was going to say rewire your brain. I mean, I think it does actually rewire your brain, but I'm not an expert to be able to talk about the science behind that. But the impact is real. And yes, the changes that happen are lasting, because after a mediation, I do multiple follow-ups, usually the first one's within the first 2 weeks, then one about a month later, and then one about 6 months later. And it is astounding, the changes that last, even to my own surprise. But sometimes you think, wow, you remember it being a big day and you remember them leaving them in a far better place than when you found them. But to hear that they are still choosing to work together and in a way that they're doing really well is fantastic. I mean, I had a 12-party mediation recently, and that was enormous. And I've only just had a follow-up from the COO, and we're now 6 months out, and the team is functioning really well. I mean, the team had completely broken down. So
it goes to the transformational nature of mediation, doesn't it? I mean, I love my role and I love getting resolutions. If I feel someone walks away and goes, that's a fair result from a litigation, or that's fair enough, or I can move on. There's a number of nuance around those sort of decisions.
Yeah.
I love that. I mean, but I have felt, I'm far less experienced than you. I have felt the power of a mediation being transformational. I had two senior executives who were entrenched in various positions after a day's process text me to say they were having a wine together at the end of the day.
It's just the best, isn't it, Damien? That is
and
just
I thought to myself,
the best.
That's remarkable. That's quite remarkable in terms of where we started and where we ended up.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Well done. I just love those stories, honestly.
I mean, I do sometimes see insurers and plaintiffs shake hands, but
yeah,
they're not having a wine at the end of the day.
Well done.
Your lens is much more on conflict more broadly. And you spoke about, the psychosocial code and the fact that it's being used as a toolkit. One of the things that I talk to people about is this notion that we sometimes conflate, a good functioning workplace with a nice one. We're a good team because we all have, morning tea together or something like that. No, I'm not saying that's
we all
not important.
agree.
It is.
We all agree with
We
one
all
another.
agree. Well, we all agree.
with the boss.
But yeah, we all funny that isn't it funny? We all say we agree.
Yeah.
But your position is very much like mine, that conflict is endemic in workplaces and is a healthy thing and needs to be dealt with. Talk us through your thinking in that space, Tania.
There's a term that I heard recently, I didn't invent, unfortunately, but I've really kind of latched onto, and that is conflict is data. Conflict is data. Yeah. And so if you can get curious about the data, as opposed to push the data away and not want to know about it, but actually welcome the data and go, okay, well, what's this telling us? What's this about? I mean, that's where the gold lies. So there's some new thinking around, well, for me, it's some new thinking around mediation as a leadership development tool. So, and so that's how I sort of justify that I'm not doing the exec coaching anymore, because I find that people going through a mediation actually develop, they then start to develop, and they do develop, leadership development in the mediation itself. So I'm giving a talk at the next REWA State Conference coming up in a couple of months about sort of beyond blame and why conflict is sort of HR's greatest tool. It's about data, and if you can get interested in the data, then you become the beneficiary of what it is that it's telling you. If you try and suppress it or try and ignore it, it's like whack-a-mole. It'll just pop up in a different form. So the symptoms, will remain and play silly buggers until you actually deal with the underlying cause.
The other thing that I say to people, now I know that workplaces aren't like sporting teams, I totally get that. But if you're in a sporting team environment like your kids and they're playing to win, compete fairly, but to win, there always is conflict, isn't there, at the higher levels around have you got a place? Are we doing this right? Is this strategy the right way? We sort of have this mindset in sporting teams. Sure, there's a conflict about this, but sometimes we think that it doesn't exist in workplaces. And often workplaces are also trying to win in their own ways. It may not be winning in that same competitive dynamic, but it brings with it the same tension.
Yeah.
So I like that. I like conflict of data. I've never heard that before. Where to from here, Tania, in terms of your role in the West?
I keep saying to all these people that, salespeople on LinkedIn that reach out to me or send me emails about how I can scale Tate. I don't want to scale Tate. I don't want to, hire people and get other people to do it. What I actually love to do is to be in the mediation room. So for me, I just want to keep doing the work that I love to do for as long as I can continue to do it. That's really the reality of it. Nothing fancy.
Well, I share that. And I hope the Queensland lawyers listening to you today will think about the use of facilitated conversations and mediations a bit more proactively at times in their workplaces. I mean, it's great that you've come from that industry and you can talk the language to lawyers, but you have a workplace mediation. Am I fair to say that that's your practice, workplace mediation? Do mediations outside of it?
I only do workplace mediation, and I do a little bit of instructional facilitation at the UWA Mediation Clinic with Dr. Jill Howson and Dr. Darren Moroney. I sort of just make the tea and coffee and add the odd comment here and then, and do a bit of coaching with parties as they're learning to do that AMDRAS accreditation. So, whilst you get an accreditation that's pretty broad, workplace is sort of the area that I understand, the area I've got, some background and experience in. And so it's the area that I like to play in. So I don't do anything else apart from workplace mediation. And I do a little bit of that instructional facilitation with Jill and Darren, because that sort of keeps my skills sharp. I probably take more notes than any other student in that room every time, thinking, oh, I've forgotten to do that. Oh, yes, empathic validation. That's right. I could have used that last week, So, so that's my area I play in.
It certainly hones your skills as a mediator and your creativity much more, this space. So one of the joys I've had about my role is just finding other like-minded people across the country and even across the globe and connecting with them. And you jumped out at me, and I really appreciate your time and expertise. Thanks for coming on the Resolution Room. I certainly hope we stay in touch.
Oh, absolutely. I'm honoured. I'm honoured that you would have me, Damien. So thank you. I think I've listened to every episode on your podcast. I've enjoyed all of them. So yeah, I really appreciate the invitation.
That's brilliant, Tania. Well, all the best, and thanks for coming on.
See you next time.